Okay, we're ready to get started on our project. First, let me tell you exactly what we're doing in each section so that you'll know what to expect. The first round that we are doing is going to make the basket blocks. And we have basket blocks here, 4 of them in the center, and 4 of them in these outside corners. You can notice that they're made of different fabrics, but it's the same pattern. Okay, so just the blocks in round 1, we're not doing the applique, that's taught in a different lesson. So just the piecing. Then round 2, we're going to do the center medallion. So we'll put these blocks together with the sashing, set them on point, and add the sawtooth border. That's round 2. And round 3, we're doing the woven blocks, which is really fun piecing. It's really intricate and fun, but it's great to watch these blocks come together. So the block, there's 3 blocks in each side, and then there's a corner block that fits together with them. So we're going to learn two different blocks to make that border. And then round 4, we do these outside borders, these middle borders, sorry, those are the middle borders. There's a little narrow green border, and I'm going to talk to you in round 4 about coping borders. That's a really good technique to learn to use in any quilt project you're doing. And also in round 4, we do these large, wide basket blocks. There's one of them in the middle of each outside border. Round 5 is these scallop blocks. You see, it creates that fun scallop pattern, but they're pieced. We're going to piece the outside scallop blocks on all of the borders. And in round 6, we'll learn the applique and put the whole thing together. So let's get started. All right, this is round 1. We're doing our basket blocks. And this is what the blocks will turn out to look like. Here's the piecing. And you can see that this is the block we're going to do for the red version of the quilt. It's going to have 2 pink blocks, one there and there, and 2 blue blocks, which will be right here on the sides. And then, of course, the sashings and everything will be different color as well. You'll notice that the outside blocks have the houndstooth border. They're a little bit different in coloration. So that's the one we're going to piece on today. So we're going to make the houndstooth background block, okay? But it's this very same pattern. And let me just show you on this example. I'm going to show you on this block. This block uses half square triangles. You can see this half square triangle unit. There's 3 of them with different fabrics, but 1, 2, 3. And then there are 2 rectangles with corner triangles on them, and then just 1 square in the middle. So that's what we're going to work on. We'll start with the half square triangles. Okay, the pattern calls for you to take your 3-inch squares. You've got 3-inch squares cut of lots of different fabrics. So you have your red mini print, your houndstooth. This is the white small floral, the blue mini print, and the pink diamonds. So take the red mini print, and it calls for you to draw a line on the wrong side of the fabric. So I've turned this over, and on the wrong side of the fabric, from corner to corner, I'm going to draw a diagonal line. It doesn't matter which 2 corners you use as long as they're opposite each other. So it could have been either of the 2 corners that we draw that line on. That's not significant. If you're using directional fabric, like the pink diamond, it has a directional print. So see, I can lay this different ways. And it doesn't really matter if that bothers you and you want to have your diamonds going all the same direction, then you can worry about that and make sure you've got your lines going the right way. But I just want to point out to you on this quilt over here, this little quilt has has used the pink diamond print in this piece of candy. And one of them's going the wrong way, and some of them are going up and down, and it really doesn't matter. So that's a personal preference. If you are worried about which direction your fabric goes, then pay attention to that. Okay, so the first thing we're going to do is pair this block that we've got the line on with a red houndstooth square, 3-inch square. We'll come over to our sewing machine, and because I'm going to use this awl to point this out. So sometimes we sew a 1/4 inch away from the line, and in some techniques we sew right directly on the line. So pay attention to what technique we're doing. On this one, it's half square triangles, so we're going to sew 1/4 inch away from the line on both sides of the line. So I'm going to bring this to my sewing machine, and I'm using a 1/4 inch quilting foot on my machine, so the blade on the presser foot is a 1/4 inch wide, so I can use that as a guide. I'm going to drop my needle down into my fabric about a 1/4 inch away from that line, put my presser foot down, and then just using that line as a guide, I'm going to watch right here and sew right down 1/4 inch away from that drawn line. Okay, now let me just tell you one other thing. It takes a bit of time to draw all those lines on the back of your squares. And on this, we don't do too many half square triangles in this block, but there are some sections where we'll do a whole lot and need a whole lot of squares with lines drawn on them. So I've got another technique that I want to show you that might make this easier for you. Let me grab another. So this one, here's another 2 3-inch squares put together. I do have a drawn line on this, so to show you that I don't need the line, I'm going to turn it so the line's going across the other way. And that doesn't really matter, but just so you can see, I don't need to draw that line. What I'm going to use, I'm going to use this tape that I put on my machine bed as a guide, okay? So what happens here, let me show you with a ruler. If I were to drop my needle down, put my ruler right up against it, and draw a line straight out so that I have a line that's exactly straight out from my needle, and I make sure that my ruler is perpendicular to the throat plate so that I know I'm going straight and I'm not crooked this way, like that or that. So I'm nice and straight. And this piece of tape I've cut to be 1/4 inch wide. So this edge of it is a straight shot from the needle, and this edge of it is a 1/4 inch seam allowance. So I'm going to use the 1/4 inch away seam allowance. I'm going to put my, drop my needle into my fabric right there, put my presser foot down. Oh, let's see, let me go back just a second and do this other corner so you'll see that I don't need my line. Yeah, let's do it this way. Okay, drop my needle into my fabric 1/4 inch from the corner, okay? Drop my presser foot, and then I'm going to, you see how I can swing this? I'm going to swing this point of the square to be even with the outside line, okay? So this time, instead of watching up here, because I don't have a line to follow, I'm going to watch right back here. I'm going to watch my point of my square as it advances through the sewing machine. I'm just going to watch as I keep that point right there along that line. And that enables me, let me pull this out, to sew right 1/4 inch away from the center line. Now if I were to do the other side, I'd turn it around and go down this side. I'm following along the bottom, the following corner, so that when I get here, you can see that my presser foot is now 1/4 inch away from that point. If I was doing this normally and not just making one example for you, I would chain all of these squares together. So I would sew that line, and then I'd take my next square and sew that line. I'd grab my next set and sew that one, and I'd sew all the way, chain all the way down one side of all of the squares, take it out of my machine, turn it around, and sew all the way down the other side of the squares so that I get all of them done at once, and that makes it quick. Then I take this line of squares. If I was doing a bunch of them, I'd have about a line of them all together. I'm going to take it over to my cutting board, and I just use I don't use a ruler, I just use my rotary cutter and just whack them apart in the center. And this doesn't have to be exact because this is the seam allowance. So you see I'm a little wider here and a little skinnier here, and that doesn't really matter. Okay, so now I've got, cut these apart, now I've got 4 half square triangles that just need to be pressed and trimmed. So I'm going to go to the iron. Now here's a little tip on your ironing. Make sure my iron is on. Before I press my seam open, I always set my seam. So I will give it a shot of steam and press it so that the thread sets down into the fabric. That'll make your seams nice and even, okay? And then I'm going to open up and I'm going to press the seam toward the red fabric on this one. That's what the pattern calls for. If it is critical in order to put the blocks together, which way the seam goes, I will always tell you in the pattern. If it doesn't matter, then you can press which way you prefer. So I'm going to press, and I like to press from the top. Some people press from the back, but sometimes when we press from the back, let's say you're pressing the seam over like that, sometimes that seam doesn't get all the way open, if you know what I mean, and we want it, instead of having a crease there, we want it to be all the way open. So I'm pressing from the top. Whoops, I'm going to do this way. And you'll notice that as I'm stitching today, I'm using red thread in my machine. And normally I would use a more neutral thread. I'd probably use white on this quilt, but I wanted you to be able to see the stitching. So there's my 4 blocks, and you can notice they're a little wonky. They're kind of crazy because I've purposely made them larger than they need to be so that we can now trim them down. This is a great technique because once we trim these blocks, they're absolutely perfect, and we make sure that that seam line dives right into the corner. So I've got this square up ruler, and this is a great tool because it has a diagonal line right on it. So I put that diagonal line right on the seam allowance, and then I scoot it up so that I make sure I'm trimming these to 2.5 inches square. So I check to make sure I've got 2.5 inches, and you can see that it's got a little square down here where the 2.5 inch is. So you can see 2.5 inches there, 2.5 inches there. And what I will do is trim off this side away from me and this side across. And then I turn my block around and measure from the trimmed side. Set that. And I like to, when I'm cutting and when I'm trimming, I like to put my line that measures which size I'm cutting up on the fabric instead of just off of it. And I think that makes me more accurate. It gives you a little tiny scotch of extra fabric to make your pieces more accurate. So now I have a perfectly trimmed block. I'll just trim these down 2.5 inches. This way, sometimes we sew a little crooked and sometimes our seam doesn't go right into the corner. So this way your seams go right into the corner because you can cut them that way. And they're perfectly square and they're exactly the right size. So it's going to go together easier. It takes a tiny bit longer, but it's going to make a difference in how quickly it goes together. So I think it's time well spent. There's another one. I continue doing that till I have all of my half square triangles pressed and trimmed. So the pattern is going to call for you to do a bunch of these. Let's see, you're going to need 8 of these. You're going to need 8 that use the, I've already sewn this one into the next thing, but 8 that use the floral. And then you do 4 each of the pink diamonds and the blue mini print. All of these are paired. Let me show you this one too. All of these are paired with the red mini print as the other half of the half square triangle. Okay? All right. So now let's do the, let me get rid of some of this garbage here. The next technique we're going to do is corner triangles. I know that you're probably familiar with this, but let me show you a few tricks that I've learned, okay? A corner triangle is where you take a larger piece, put a corner of a square against the corner, right sides together, sew on the diagonal line once again, and then press it open, and you've created a corner triangle on this piece. This base piece can be any size. It could be a square, it could be a rectangle, and this is a great technique to add that little piece on there. On this technique as well, I have drawn it. The pattern calls for you to draw the diagonal line. But if you use this method with the tape on your machine bed, you won't need to draw those lines. So on this one though, we're going to sew right on the line. Okay? So let's take this to the sewing machine. We have the drawn line on, but we don't need to use it because I can use my guide that's on my machine bed. And on this technique, corner triangles, you sew right on the drawn line, not a 1/4 inch away. So you're going to be right on that line, which means I'm going to use the center line, which is the left side of my tape. If I'm doing the corner half square triangles, or if I'm sewing a 1/4 inch away from my drawn line, I want to be using the right side of my tape as a guide. So I'm going to use the left side. And one other thing, don't know how to show you this exactly, but if you're going to sew right exactly on that line, when you open this piece up, it may not open exactly big enough to cover the previous triangle that was on there on the base piece. That's because that seam line is going to take up a little room and your fabric needs a little bit of room to open up. So I always sew just to the very side of that drawn line, or if I'm not using the drawn line as a guide, I will sew to the very side, just a needle width away from where that diagonal line would be. and I sew to the side toward my seam allowance, not to the other side, because then that would make my triangle too small, wouldn't it? So I'm going to sew to the seam allowance side, just a smidge. Smidge is a good word, don't you think? And so right down there till you get to the end. Let me cut that, and then I can show you right over here that when I open this up, let's just finger press it, it covers completely the rest of that rectangle that was there. If I had sewn right on the line, I might be a little shy. So this makes you very accurate, okay? But before we open that up, we're going to trim, and I always trim with my rotary cutter, and I just eyeball it. You don't have to measure that because it's in your seam allowance, not going to show. Unless I'm doing little tiny pieces, then I usually just use my scissors and snip them off. So I'll take this to my pressing surface and open it up. I do like to use steam, and as I'm pressing, I kind of like to notice, is my line straight? And if it isn't, I'll straighten it out. I usually use the big flat side of my iron to push that triangle open, because that makes it come open more evenly. Okay, so this piece is ready. So we've got let's lay out the pieces of our block. We've got the square, we've got this corner triangle unit, the half square triangles that we made before. Oh, and I don't need this one because I've already sewn these three together. So that's the piece, that's the elements of the block. Now, in order to put this together, you're going to sew these two elements together first, then sew those to the square, and then sew these three elements together and sew those to the rest of the block. So very simple, so let's get started and do that. Let me take this over to the sewing machine. And what's kind of nice about this guide I've got on the machine now, even though I use it for diagonal sewing, it's a great guide for when you're piecing, because now you can see that I've used that 1/4 inch line all the way down. And here's another little tip, as if I come to a seam that's pressed toward my needle, so that sometimes my presser foot will I wonder if you can see that, it'll kind of fold that back and make a mess. I'll sometimes use my awl to kind of push that back into place as I'm sewing, so that I don't run over my finger, because we can sew over our fingers. That's happened before. I sewed over my finger before a couple of times. It only takes a couple times and then you kind of quit doing it. You get smarter. I'm going to press this before we put it to the next piece. It's always a good idea to press before you sew the next seam, because it makes a difference in your accuracy. Okay, it's a good idea to check, remind yourself that you've got the right edges going together so you don't have your block put together wrong. So I just kind of visually glance at my block, make sure I'm doing it right. I think we've all done it wrong a few times and had to unpick. So we want the houndstooth against the houndstooth, the baskets away. So we're going to sew that seam right there. So I'll set them together before I go under my machine so I don't get confused and do it wrong, because it's happened before. Now as I go down here, I'm coming to a seam that I could easily unfold as my sewing machine comes upon it. So I'm going to hold it down so that it'll go underneath my presser foot and not cause a problem and fold open. Now we've got this done, and this didn't tell me in the pattern which way to press this, or maybe it did, but I'm going to press, since it doesn't really matter, I'm going to press toward the square, because I have a lot of seams here. So when you can favor pressing away from a lot of seams, that will give you less bulk, okay? So first I'm going to set the seams, and then open it up. I kind of eyeball to make sure that I'm nice and square, nice and straight. You know, you can stretch fabric out a lot, so you can kind of eyeball if it's straight or not. And there's that unit, and we just have to sew it to this unit, okay? So, quickly sew this side together. And when I have another seam I'm coming across here, you can see where the intersection of these two seams is. So I'm going to make sure that I sew right to the side of that on the inside of the seam edge. so that my points won't be cut off. All right, this is one basket block done. We've got to press that open now. And make that lay down nice and straight. And there we go. Okay, so we've got our basket block. This is the one that's going to go in the outside corner. You're going to make 4 of them. They don't have the applique like I stated before, but we have 4 like this. You're going to have, once a reminder again, 2 that are pink and 2 that are blue. Okay, now before we leave this unit, let me tell you one more thing. I like to check the sizes of my units as I go through a quilt. That way everything's going to piece together really easily. So this block, it will say at the end of each unit what size it should be. It says it should be 7.5 inches square. So let's take this pink one, and I'm going to put this square up ruler on it because it gives me the inches from 1 in one corner down to 7.5. I can measure very easily. 7.5 inches square. You can see that this block is perfect. Okay, the only thing sticking out is a little bit of thread, so that's perfect. I'm going to set that aside. But I wanted to show you this one that I made earlier because it's a little wonky. So when I measure this one, so I've got my 7.5 line here, and I'm just a smidge short on this side, like about almost 1/8 here and almost 1/8 there. And I make sure that my line is going in the center. Actually, if I move my line to the center, then my short edge is on this outside edge and on this outside edge. So what I do is I'll take a pin from my pin cushion and put one in this side and one in this side. That way, when I pick these up later to seam them together, I will know. Let's pretend they were going to go sewn to this next block. Let's pretend I was sewing them to this block. Let's turn this way. When I put this on top of this block to sew it, instead of lining those edges up exactly like that, I'm going to give myself a little room here, and I'm going to lose that little smidgen that I was missing in the seam allowance. Okay, you won't even miss it. So I'm going to line that up, make sure, so that pin just reminds me that this block is a little short. So that will keep you accurate, and we're done with round 1. So get ready, come back for round 2, and let's see what happens next.